All right, it is 12:40. On behalf of the Florida Department of Health in Volusia County, I would like to welcome you again to the Path for Hope Virtual Summit. My name is Helena Gerard, and I will be the facilitator in this plenary session. You have joined the session entitled Adverse Childhood Experiences and Substance Use, Intersection and Prevention. This session is being recorded and all participants will be muted during the session. There will be a question and answer time at the end of the session for you to pose questions. You may raise your hand using the reaction button at the bottom of your screen, and we will then call on you and allow you to unmute yourself. You may also submit questions during the presentation in the chat box, and we will pose them to Sarah at the end of the session if time allows. If not, she has graciously offered to respond to those via email. So definitely encourage the chat and the questions during and at the end of the presentation. I also want to thank the Path for Hope Summit Planning Committee partners, the Advent Health, Community Coalition Alliance, One Voice for Volusia, SMA Healthcare, and the Volusia Recovery Alliance. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Bacon, Control and Prevention, and supports the center from her position in the Office of Strategy and Innovation. In this role, she provides strategic leadership and coordination across a range of injury and violence topics as they relate to adverse childhood experiences, or as a lot of us know them, ACEs. Sarah is focused on advancing the evidence of effectiveness and prevention of ACEs and mitigation of their impact, and on ensuring that the science is translated into action in communities across the country. We are so grateful you could be here. Welcome, Dr. Sarah Bacon, and thank you. I can't wait to hear what you have to share.
Well, thank you so much. And is my sound okay? Can you hear me? Thumbs up? Great. Well, thank you. I am so excited to be here. I have to say, I can't see any of you, so I feel like I'm just sitting in my little office at home talking to my computer. But I'm just going to pretend that you're all smiling at me and nodding vigorously as I talk, and then hopefully I'll get to see some of you for some questions. So I am really excited to connect with this group in particular because I spent a lot of my time in the Injury Center at CDC focused on overdose prevention. And one of the things I found, and that I know you all know really well, is that you don't talk about overdose prevention for long without talking about childhood trauma, without talking about ACEs or childhood adversity. They are so inextricably related, connected. And that's whether you're a data person or a policy person or a practice person or a clinician or an academic, they're connected no matter what domain or aspect or lens you bring to these conversations. We just can't escape it. So we may as well have a really intentional, coordinated approach to prevention. And in fact, that's what we're doing in the Injury Center at CDC. We've named adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, overdose prevention, and suicide prevention as our 3 strategic priorities, not only because they represent such a significant part of the burden of the public health challenges facing our country, but also because there's so many opportunities for shared prevention, for us to learn from each other in these various pursuits and domains, because they are all so related. So I'll get a bit more into that during our conversation today, if I can get my slides to move in the right direction. I'm going to start with setting the stage and just giving kind of a level set for what ACEs are and why they're so important for any conversation related to public health. ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, are potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood. So we're talking about any time from birth through age 17. And they include things like child abuse and neglect, whether we're talking about physical or sexual or emotional abuse and neglect. They also include various household challenges. So things like substance use in the home, unmanaged mental illness in the home, separation from a parent. Historically, we talked about that because of either divorce or incarceration. I'll talk in a little bit about some of the expanded ways we're talking about separation from a parent and ACEs more generally. So what you see here were the original kind of traditional ACEs as measured in the original study from the late 1990s. And unfortunately, we know that ACEs are really common. Over 2/3 of adults report having experienced at least one ACE. And this is probably an underestimate because this is taking a group of adults and asking them to report kind of retrospectively on their childhood. When we have data looking at kids over time and more kind of contemporaneous reporting, we know that this is probably actually an underestimate of the number of ACEs that people experience. 1 in 6 people report having experienced 4 or more ACEs. And that's where we start to get into some really harmful consequences. And we'll talk more about that in a moment as well. There's a little bit of a paradox with respect to ACEs in terms of who experiences them. Because on the one hand, ACEs don't discriminate by geography, by sex, by race, by socioeconomic status. Everyone can and does experience ACEs. However, we also know that women, sexual and gender minority individuals, and most racial and ethnic groups do report having higher likelihood of having experienced 4 or more ACEs. So we have some really important equity considerations to attend to in this conversation about ACEs. We also know that ACEs don't occur in a vacuum. They occur in context and in environments. And I love this metaphor of the tree, where you have the visible parts of the tree that are the trunk and the branches and the leaves, and you can sort of get a sense of the health of the tree from taking a look at whether the leaves are bright and green and fresh or falling off, or whether the branches are healthy. And that's usually what we talk about when we're talking about ACEs, the things that we can see. But this metaphor that came from Wendy Ellis and her group with the Center for Community Resilience at George Washington University is so helpful for reminding us that that tree grows out of a certain context. We need to be paying attention to the roots and the soil and the environment that produces and sustains that tree. This is a helpful way for us to think about things like housing insecurity or racial discrimination or community violence. Some of those roots in the soil and the context that can either make ACEs more likely in the first place, or, and more likely, and exacerbate the impact of ACEs so that when they do occur, they are more harmful than they would have otherwise been. So it's a helpful way to point us toward more comprehensive thinking about ACEs, but it's also a really important reminder for us to think about the various opportunities for prevention. Yes, we can attend to the health of the tree and the parts that we see, and that's a lot of the prevention strategies that we engage in. But let's also address the health of the soil and the roots of this tree. Let's work at the systems level and the institutional level and the community level to make sure that that's a context and an environment that can turn into a healthy tree for everyone. So I really love that metaphor, just to sort of guide us into more comprehensive thinking. I mentioned before that ACEs are a really critical consideration for all of our public health conversations. And I don't just mean with respect to things like substance use or overdose and suicide, the things that we focus on within the injury center. I'm also talking about our physical health. I'm talking about chronic disease and infectious disease. We're talking about things related to cardiac health and diabetes and obesity and smoking and COPD and really across every domain of health. When you follow the breadcrumbs back into their origins, you land on ACEs. So on the one hand, this gives us a sense of how critical it is that we address ACEs and how powerful they are in really setting the stage for our health and well-being across the life course. Again, it also tells us what immense power we can have when we're talking about prevention of ACEs, because when we prevent ACEs, we're also going to have impact on all of the things you see here on this slide related to every aspect of our health, physical health, mental health, emotional well-being, but also life opportunities, employment, and educational attainment, and just general sense of happiness and well-being. Sorry if I'm jumping around slides here. I want to make a really important point about how ACEs impact all of these outcomes, because I think it's really easy for us to jump to one of the pathways, which is that the experience of ACEs can lead to unhealthy coping strategies, right? So people who experience a lot of trauma and adversity during childhood may take on certain risky health behaviors as a maladaptive coping strategy. That's particularly relevant when we're talking about the intersection of ACEs and substance use, right? People may begin using substances as a way to cope with the trauma that they've experienced. And that is one of the pathways by which ACEs have a relationship with all of these other health outcomes through the adoption of health risk behaviors. But it's not the only one. We need to be talking about what's called toxic stress. We all know stress. We all know different forms of stress. Some stress is positive, some stress is tolerable, but some stress is toxic. And chronic exposure to toxic stress can actually change our biology, can actually change our neuro and endocrine and hormonal systems in ways that then make our bodies more vulnerable to certain maladaptive health outcomes. So we need to be really aware of that it's not necessarily just a function of the choices people make to cope with the adversity they experience. It's actually changing physiology, changing biology, changing brain structure in such a way that makes some of these health outcomes more likely. We're talking about changing organ, tissue, and brain development. And I wanted to show you, just to sort of amplify this point, what you're seeing on this slide is a comparison of two brains. One is the brain of someone on the left side who's experienced safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments, the kind of stability and warmth and well-being and positive and tolerable stress that we all envision for ourselves and we all envision for our children and all of the children in our communities. And you can see within those circled areas in the temporal lobes, a lot of brain activity. You don't even have to, I'm not a neuroscientist, you don't need that to be able to understand what you're seeing in this slide. Just look at the colors and how that part of the brain is lighting up. On the right is someone who's experienced a significant amount of childhood trauma and adversity. And you can see that there's an actual change in the brain of which parts of the brain can be activated under what circumstances. And we're looking at the temporal lobes. These are the parts of the brain responsible for cognitive reasoning and decision-making and emotion regulation and relationship skills. Really, really critical parts of the brain for navigating every aspect of life. There are physical, organic differences in what we see here. I want to spend a few slides just making this connection a little bit more explicit, specific to substance use. And I'll tell you, I have a slide like this for almost any of those outcomes I mentioned. So this could be ACEs and diabetes, or ACEs and lung disease, or ACEs and cardiac disease, or ACEs and obesity. In this case, we're looking at the relationship between ACEs and substance use. And this is from the original ACEs study that was conducted, the CDC Kaiser study that was conducted in the mid and late 1990s. And just to orient you to what you're seeing on the slide, look at the dark kind of red maroon bar on the right. Those are people who have experienced 4 or more ACEs. So you can see both for smokers, for people who report having alcohol use disorder, anyone who's ever used illicit drugs, and then anyone who's ever injected drugs. And what you see is the classic, we call it a dose response relationship. The more ACEs someone reports having experienced, the higher their odds ratio of falling into any of these categories. And for each of these, pretty remarkably, you can see the progression. The more ACEs someone experiences, the higher risk they are for these various levels or forms of involvement in substance use. The same is true, this holds across time and across different sorts of substances and in different contexts. So as you all know painfully well, we are in the midst of what is really a polysubstance epidemic, but started at least nominally as an opioid overdose epidemic. So this is basically the same presentation, same way of looking at the data, but this time specific to prescription pain medication. And again, here you can see this time it's sort of a yellow color. People who have experienced 5 or more ACEs report significantly higher odds of use of prescription pain medication at rates that differ from doctor's orders or use without a prescription at all. Just one more of these to drive this point home. And many of you have probably encountered the reality that stimulants are absolutely back on the scene. And this is now both really an opioid and stimulant epidemic. And here we're looking at stimulant use and use disorders. And again, I'll draw your attention in the left panel to the kind of goldenrod, let's call it color. Folks who've experienced 4 or more ACEs across the board have much higher involvement in things like past year amphetamine type substance use disorder, and then breaking that down just to cocaine, again, with past year cocaine use and use disorder. We just see such a consistent story. And the story holds too with age of initiation, which we know is a really, really important variable and something that we can pay attention to with respect to prevention for substance use disorder, that even delayed initiation can be helpful for changing the trajectory and experience of substance use and substance use disorder. Okay, that was all a bunch of really hard, horrible, depressing news. ACEs are common and they're really bad, and they have such a wide range of harmful impact. So let's turn up the vibe and the mood a little bit and talk about the great news. And we have a lot of great news. We have a lot of great science, and we have a lot of great practice, and we integrate the science and the practice to generate a lot of resources for what we can do. We can create positive childhood experiences. We can build safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments so that all children have equitable opportunity to thrive. So I want to talk a little bit about what we can do to achieve this. The first and most important thing we can do to prevent ACEs before they happen is to strengthen the economic stability of families. We know from research that families that are facing financial hardship are at higher risk for stress, for depression, for conflict, and all of those things, of course, compromise parenting, compromise an individual's sense of well-being and health, and they increase the risk for both ACEs and substance misuse. So we're talking here about childcare subsidies so that parents can leave their kids in capable care and go to work. We're talking about a livable wage for that work, paid sick leave, paid medical leave, access to affordable healthcare, access to unemployment assistance and food assistance, housing assistance, and debt relief. It's important too to note that I'm talking about this here as a prevention strategy for ACEs, but this is also among the most powerful of our prevention strategies for suicide. This is a really powerful approach. And I want you to think back to that metaphor of the tree and the pair of ACEs. This kind of work gets us into the roots and the soil. It's changing the environment and the context of families and communities. So of course, it then has implications and helpful effects for all of the outcomes that we all work on and care a lot about. The next one that I want to talk about is promoting social norms that protect against violence and adversity. We need to constantly push back against the pervasive messages and norms in our culture that tell us that violence is the norm and that adversity is the fault of those who are experiencing it. There's a lot of stigma associated with that, and it is not helpful. So this is our second strategy, to promote social norms that protect against those ideas, to protect against violence and adversity. So here we're talking about things like public education campaigns, policy and legislative approaches to reduce corporal punishment and promote effective and safe discipline strategies in childcare and school settings. We can talk about bystander approaches, which equip people with the language and the skills that they need to intervene when they see violent language and violent norms being perpetrated. This is sort of a slow burn strategy. It's one that takes a long time and takes kind of a high level of dosage. You really have to infuse your work and infuse your messaging and get partners at the table to do this so that you can have enough saturation to make a difference. But again, this is another one that's really addressing the roots in the soil and changing the conversation, changing the norms around how we talk about these things. We also want to make sure that we are starting our kids off on the right path. We want to give them all the tools possible and all of the right environments to encourage and support their healthy development, and to let kids be the authors of their own development in age-appropriate ways. So we know that the earlier we can establish those safe and stable relationships and environments that I've talked about, the more likely we are to prevent ACEs. Earlier is always better. So this happens, of course, in the family context, but it's also important to be really clear that this goes beyond families. Schools and communities have a role to play here as well in ensuring a strong start for kids. Early childhood visitation programs are a great example of things that can prevent ACEs and later substance use and misuse. They provide just information for one thing, but also a lot of caregiver support, training about child health and development and support and care that families need in their homes. These programs have been shown with data and really great research to reduce child abuse and neglect, but they also improve outcomes for parents, including outcomes related to substance use and substance misuse. High quality childcare also gives kids a strong start, a strong foundation for future learning and opportunity. And these are programs that improve everything about a kid's experience. So their physical, their social, their emotional, and their cognitive development, all of those things to give them language skills, literacy skills, school readiness. We've seen that kids who participate in these programs show better academic outcomes, so better math, better language, better social skills. They have lower rates of grade retention, so having to stay back a grade. And they also have a higher likelihood of graduating from college, of having better self-reported mental and emotional health outcomes later in life, lower rates of depression, lower rates of substance use, and lower child maltreatment outcomes, even across generations. So it's so critical, so important that we invest early in providing a strong start for kids. We also want to give kids and their parents healthy relationship skills. And these come from social emotional learning approaches and cognitive behavioral skills. These are things that give students skills for effective communication, problem solving, alcohol and drug resistance, conflict management, empathy, coping, emotional awareness, emotional regulation. Think back to that slide I showed you of the 2 different brain scans where we saw all that activity in the frontal lobe or the temporal lobe. That's where all of these things come from. So the more we can strengthen those, the more resilient they are to potential detriment in the future. We have some really great systematic reviews, just careful reviews of the science of these programs. And they show us that they significantly reduce not only substance use or delay initiation of substance experimentation, but they also have impact on things like peer violence, on depression and anxiety, on suicidal thoughts and behavior, on delinquency, involvement in crime and involvement in violence specifically. And they're associated with improvements in reading, writing, and math proficiency. Remember here too, though, that supporting children means supporting families, which means supporting communities. And we can also teach skills through parenting and family relationship approaches. So programs like this cover developmentally appropriate expectations for kids and child behavior. They teach parents positive behavior management, positive discipline, parental monitoring, problem solving, safe and effective discipline, and effective and supportive parent-child communication, which is so hard for all of us. I think we could all use at least a booster on that from time to time. And we see that those programs are associated with reduced youth substance use, including opioid use, and reduced parental stress, which then of course reduces the risk for ACEs. Meaningful connections to caring adults. This is a positive childhood experience that can create resilience and buffer risk for young people. And I really love this strategy so much because it's the sort of perfect intersection of primary prevention, but also acknowledging that we don't achieve perfect primary prevention. We don't prevent all ACEs before they happen, but when they do happen, we can still mitigate the impact. We can still buffer against the risk of all of those outcomes and kind of disrupt that chain that connects ACEs to all of the other tough outcomes that we talked about earlier. So this is really about primary and secondary prevention. So we can talk here about things like mentoring and after-school programs. There are a lot of mentoring programs, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Boys and Girls Club of America. We know that youth who participate in these are less likely to skip classes. They're less likely to skip school, initiate drug and alcohol use. They're less likely to engage in fighting. We also see positive things like improvements in academic performance, improvements even in their parent-child relationships at home, student-teacher relationships, and parental trust. After-school activities and programs also provide a lot of opportunities for young people to strengthen those behavioral and leadership and cognitive skills and to be involved in positive activities. So again, here we see all of these improvements, not only with respect to ACEs and substance use, but all of these other domains, academic achievement, emotional health and well-being. It's just sort of a win across the board. One thing I want to point out in particular that's so important with all of these strategies, but these in particular, is that these have to be implemented in accordance with the evidence and using specific tested programs. Mentoring and after-school programs are not all created equally, and some actually can do more harm than good. So if this is a strategy that you're exploring for implementation, be sure that you choose an evidence-based program. And at the end of my presentation, I'm going to share a link to a great resource that has all of the best available evidence. It's sort of like a menu for, within each of these strategies, what are some specific examples of the programs that we have vetted and reviewed. And I would really encourage you to use that for guidance if you're at the point of program selection and implementation. The final strategy that I want to talk about is intervening to lessen harms and the long-term, intermediate and long-term harms of ACEs. And this is about secondary prevention or mitigating the harmful consequences of ACEs and applying the principles of trauma-informed care. And I imagine a number of you are real experts in both principle and practice of trauma-informed care. Primary prevention is always critical. It should always be at the table. But this strategy has important applications, I think, in particular for the intersection of ACEs and substance use. So here we're talking about trauma-informed services in primary care settings, with pediatric settings, victim-centered services like hotlines or crisis intervention services, various forms of treatment and trauma-informed care to address the specific dimensions either of ACEs or substance use. And they've all been shown to reduce symptoms of PTSD, depression, anxiety, shame, behavioral challenges. They improve parenting behaviors. They improve youth behaviors. All of these reduce risk both for substance misuse and ACEs and contribute to those safe and healthy and thriving relationships and environments that we need in order to prevent ACEs. Whoops, wrong way again. I'll get it before we're done here. I want to close with this because it's such, to me, a powerful reminder of the power of prevention of ACEs. When we prevent ACEs, we are preventing depression. We are preventing asthma and stroke and cancer. Experimentation and substance use disorder. When we prevent ACEs, we're preventing all of these things across the life course. So, so powerful. And I like to close on this just because I think it's such an optimistic, positive place to close and to know what we can do when we prevent ACEs. And finally, this may be the most important slide of any that I can offer you today because it's got two links that I hope you will explore at some point. One is to our veto violence trainings, and there's an ACEs-specific training that has a lot of the content and goes into some more depth with what we talked about here today. But it also has some more generalizable prevention in practice kind of resources and tips for partner engagement and policy planning and program evaluation and implementation, every aspect sort of from start to finish of what it takes to put science into practice and move practice into prevention. The second link you see is the resource that I mentioned that is the best available evidence for ACEs prevention. It's from a suite of technical packages that we generated at CDC and includes all of the strategies I talked about today and much more specific examples of named programmatic approaches that are examples of those various approaches and strategies, along with some additional implementation advice, et cetera. So hang on to that. And with that, I will close and open it up for any questions, whether from chat, or I don't know if we have the ability for folks to come off mic and just ask directly, but if we do, please go for it. And thank you all so much for having me today. I really appreciate the chance to connect with you, and thank you for the work that you're all doing.
Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. That was wonderful. Okay, yes, if you would like to enter anything in the chat, or we can also unmute you if you raise your hand. So feel free to do either. Thank you so much. Very good information and links. Would love to get a copy of this presentation so I can share with our staff. Is that possible?
Absolutely, yes. I think there's already a PDF available, or I'm happy. I can put my email in the chat, and folks are welcome to reach out directly to me. Or I think it'll be available maybe through the Path for Hope Summit website. But yes, and all of the links are included there. And I see the question about the training. It's free. This is CDC providing a resource that we know will be important for every community everywhere. And so the whole point is for everyone to have access. There's several different modules. And I find that they're really great for, you can pull out a little blurb and share it, if you're doing your own presentation. There's also different modules for educators or for the faith-based community, or for, just clinicians and kind of different professional slices, so that, if you have a particular orientation to how you approach this work, there are trainings that are sort of customized to your lens and perspective. So definitely check those out. And I, again, would really encourage folks to explore the prevention and practice resources that are available on that Veto Violence website. Those are just really great sort of step-by-step organizing and planning tools, regardless, whether you're focused on ACEs or something else, that can just really help provide a nice structure and sort of benchmarks and tips and tricks and case studies and things like that for all of your work. So I would invite everyone to explore those as well. And I see, Elena, I'll either let you drive and tell me where to pay attention, or I can keep an eye on the chat. What do you prefer?
I can read them to you if you're okay with that.
That's great, yeah.
Okay. Here's one that says, you mentioned mental illness as an ACE, but what about physical illness as a cause in addition to the outcome of ACEs?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. And I will say first, with respect to mental illness, it's a challenge to find the right way to talk about that, because we don't want to stigmatize mental illness itself or help-seeking behaviors associated with mental illness. So it's why I'm careful to always say unmanaged mental illness. I think in many cases, a managed mental illness in the home or from a parent or caregiver can actually be the basis for a positive childhood experience, because what it shows is an adult taking agency and ownership for their health and well-being. So if a parent is on medication or seeking some sort of treatment or therapy to address and manage their mental illness, I think that's a source of fantastic strength and is a positive childhood experience. That wasn't your question though, so I'll answer your question. Physical illness, I think that we would be reluctant to classify that as an ACE in and of itself, but you're correct in pointing out that it can have implications for ACEs. particularly because we as a society don't typically support people very well who have physical illness, especially chronic physical illness or ailments. And the result can be, first of all, financial strain. So that's why, the financial stability and resources and policy to provide financial stability, even in the face of long-term medical challenges, is really, really important, because we still need parents and caregivers to be available for the emotional nurturing and support of their children. Physical illness can take you out of the picture, really. It's a lot to manage just the illness itself, your energy or pain, or whatever kind of disruption comes with the illness itself. And then all of just what I call kind of the business of being sick is a full-time job sometimes for some people. So yes, I think we should be careful to not call it an ACE in and of itself, but very important to recognize the implications that it can have for ACEs and the opportunities for us to do something about it. So I would say, again, that first strategy, ensuring the financial stability of families, that extends pretty robustly to the domain of physical health.
Thank you. And then we have another comment. You replied, thank you, or thanks. OD2A Duval is hiring school health nurses, and I'd love any tools and materials I could get into their hands.
Absolutely. And I will happily follow up with some links to that. But so the ACEs training is a great place to start. A number of you are also probably familiar with a lot of the tools really driven by SAMHSA, but a lot of other organizations as well, on trauma-informed care. I think all school staff, so not just teachers and administrators and nurses, but I'm even talking about, groundskeeping and engineering and janitorial staff, anyone who has that much contact with our kids. Sometimes our kids spend more hours in the day with school staff than with parents and caregivers, need to be trained on recognizing the signs of trauma and incorporating the principles of trauma-informed care into every interaction with children, whether they know of trauma or not. So I'm happy to share some resources, but I would, even just a quick Google of SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and trauma-informed care, has some fantastic resources, as do other agencies, as does the American Academy of Pediatrics. So I would add those as sort of a really nice complement to what we have on that veto violence page as great resources for all school professionals. School health nurses are a fantastic idea. I'm happy to hear of OD2A funds being used to support that really great resource. So congratulations, Duval, for that.
Right, and then wonderful and important information. This information can help decrease stigma. Yes.
Yes, a lot of work to do on that front, but I think we've got an army ready to do it.
Absolutely. Another thank you. Awesome. How can we help?
Oh my goodness. Thank you for asking. I think you were actually, I think I should be asking that of you. I think all of you here you're doing it. I mean, you are the workforce, and I know you bring a lot more than your work lives to this work. But I truly believe you are doing it. And it's my job at CDC to listen to what your experiences are and figure out how we can build the resources you need to keep doing the work. And also just to honor and acknowledge the importance and difficulty of the work that you do. So you can help by taking care of yourselves and each other so that you can keep going. And you can help by letting me know when there's something you need from CDC that we don't have yet. We'll figure out a way to build it because it's our job to support and sustain you.
Wonderful. We need you.
We're here and ready. We like to slow ourselves down with bureaucracy from time to time, but we're doing our best.
Oh, this has been wonderful. If nobody else has any questions, thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing your expertise. If you all would just go back to your program. You can go into your next session. And thank you to Florida State University for managing our surveys for the session and for the entire summit. So see you all in your next session. Thank you again, Sarah. Have a wonderful day.
It's my pleasure. Thank you all and have a great summit. Bye, everybody.
Bye.